These are not ballistic missile submarines. These are not submarines that launch nuclear missiles at cities. These are hunter-killer type submarines.
Is an external to the Navy, high-level panel of very qualified people. That is, they have the security clearances and the technical knowledge.
In 1968, a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear missiles vanished without a trace. For over 5 decades, the world believed it was just a tragic accident deep in the Pacific. But in 2025, declassified files, leaked audio, and long-hidden footage exposed a truth far darker than anyone imagined. The sub didn't just sink, it nearly triggered the Third World War.
Military war materiel. You're talking about a situation that could very likely start a nuclear war. So even if you can figure out how to do it, you have to do it in secret.
How did the United States locate the submarine, and why did the government bury the truth for so long? Join us as we reveal the shocking secrets behind the Soviet K-129. Disappearance of the Soviet submarine K-129. In March 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine known as K-129 vanished in the North Pacific. It was on a routine patrol deep underwater, carrying almost 100 crew members and 3 nuclear-armed missiles. For a few days, no one noticed anything strange. Then, without warning or distress signals, the submarine stopped responding. Just like that, it was gone. When contact was lost, the Soviet Navy didn't go public. They quietly raised the alarm and scrambled their Pacific fleet. The search was massive but hidden, spreading across thousands of square miles of ocean. Ships and aircraft scoured the waves and listened below, but not a single signal came from the missing submarine. Inside Soviet command centers, panic brewed, but outside the world kept moving, unaware of the storm unfolding beneath the sea. However, what happened next left the Soviets in complete shock. Keep watching to find out how the United States pulled the most outstanding salvage operation in naval history. While the Soviets were searching unthinkingly, the United States was already a step ahead. American listening posts and underwater sensors had recorded something unusual around the time K-129 went missing. It was a low, deep sound, a violent acoustic spike in the middle of the Pacific, about 2,500 kilometers northwest of Hawaii. It didn't sound like natural seismic activity. It sounded like a submarine exploding. That clue changed everything. Quietly, American submarines began sweeping the area. Using classified detection gear, they eventually found the wreck of K-129 lying deep on the ocean floor, nearly 5 kilometers down. The Soviets were still searching hundreds of kilometers off course, following a flawed navigational estimate. They didn't even know the Americans had already found their sub. Both sides kept the situation tightly locked. The Cold War was still in full force. If the Soviets admitted they had lost a nuclear sub, it would be a massive embarrassment. If the Americans admitted they had located it first, the consequences could be explosive. No newspaper reported the disappearance. No radio mentioned the wreck. The ocean held its silence, and both nations chose secrecy over truth. But behind closed doors, the mood inside Moscow had turned suspicious. Some senior officers began to believe K-129 hadn't just vanished. They suspected an attack. American involvement couldn't be ruled out, they thought. After all, why was the United States suddenly more active in that part of the ocean? Tension rose quietly, without any official accusation. Meanwhile, American intelligence agencies were already thinking ahead. The submarine on the seafloor held not just weapons, but technology and secrets, possibly even Soviet codes. So the CIA came up with a bold idea. They wouldn't just study the wreck, they would bring it up. This idea led to the birth of Operation Azorian, a covert mission that would take years of planning and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Keep watching because the story is about to get a lot wilder than you thought. Before any crane or cable could be built, American analysts needed to map the wreck in detail. They wanted to know exactly what they were dealing with. Deep-sea imaging started, and the United States quietly gathered more information than the Soviet Union ever would. The Americans had the advantage, and they intended to use it. Inside the Soviet Union, the story was being buried just as the wreck. No official announcement was ever made. Families of the 98 sailors who were on board received vague explanations, if anything at all. Some were told the sub was missing. Others were told their loved ones had died in a training accident. Many were visited by officers who told them to stop asking questions. A few who pushed too hard found themselves facing serious trouble. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was dangerous. As the years passed, the mystery of K-129 grew, whispered in military corridors and passed along through rumors. With no official cause and no recovery, speculation filled the gap. Some believed there had been a mechanical failure that triggered the disaster. Others suspected an accidental launch of a missile or a fire in the torpedo room. But a more chilling theory also emerged, one that suggested someone on board may have tried to act alone or even defect and was stopped too late. The details were hazy, but the fear behind them was real. So far, everything stayed beneath the surface. But in the decades that followed, a few quiet leaks and strange coincidences would begin to raise new questions. And in time, the effort to uncover the truth would turn into something far bigger than anyone expected. The story of K-129 wasn't just about a lost sub. It was about what was found, what was hidden, and what almost happened. The wreck was just the beginning. What came next would turn secrecy into scandal and silence into something far darker. And that is where we're headed next. Stay tuned. American efforts to lift the Soviet K-129. Not long after the wreck of K-129 was quietly located deep under the Pacific, the CIA made a bold move. They wanted to bring it up, not just to study it or take pictures, but to physically recover it from nearly 5 kilometers under the ocean. The operation was called Project Azorian, and it was one of the most secret and expensive missions in Cold War history. But it couldn't be done in plain sight. So the CIA came up with a clever cover. They reached out to billionaire Howard Hughes, whose name was already tied to strange and ambitious projects. Under the story of deep-sea mining, a special ship would be built, one that could secretly grab hold of the submarine and lift it from the ocean floor. That ship became the Hughes Glomar Explorer. On the surface, it was a commercial vessel made to harvest valuable minerals from the seabed. Inside, it was a mechanical giant, designed with one hidden purpose. It held a massive claw-like structure tucked beneath its hull, made to reach into the deep and lift something heavy, and the weight it had to lift was no small task. The wreckage of the K-129 submarine weighed around 2,000 tons. Pulling something that large from 16,000 feet below the surface had never been done before. The ship was built in secret, away from the press and foreign eyes. By the time it launched, the operation was already in motion. In July 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer arrived over the wreck site. The crew lowered the recovery claw through the moon pool at the ship's center and began the long, slow process of reaching the sub. It took days just to get the system down to the wreck. Then came the grab, the moment everything depended on. The arms closed around part of the submarine and began to lift. For a while, things looked like they were going according to plan, but halfway through the operation, something happened that shattered the CIA's hope. You see, the arm system failed, something snapped, and a large part of K-129 broke away and sank back to the bottom. The Americans only managed to pull up the forward section. Publicly, the CIA later claimed they found nothing of value, just rusted metal and decayed scraps. That was the story released to the few officials who asked questions. But that version wasn't the truth. Hidden away from public view, the team had recorded everything. The cameras showed far more than old pipes or broken steel. Inside the recovered part of the sub, they found a nuclear torpedo. It was still intact, sitting cold and quiet among the wreckage. There were also control panels, encrypted documents, and the remains of some of the sailors. The bodies, still wearing uniforms, were handled with care, but no announcement was ever made. They were photographed for records, then buried at sea in a private ceremony. No one in the Soviet Union was informed. Not a single family knew their loved ones had been found. When word of the American recovery began to reach Soviet intelligence circles, it caused an uproar behind closed doors. Moscow suspected something had happened, but without hard proof, they couldn't do much. They couldn't accuse the United States without exposing their failure to locate the wreck. And because everything had been done under the fake cover of deep-sea mining, even the press didn't know what to look for. The United States stuck to its cover story, and the Soviets could only watch from a distance. For decades, what the CIA recovered remained locked away. But in 2025, long after the Cold War ended, internal files from Project Azorian were finally unsealed. A set of newly released documents, once marked as top secret, confirmed what many had suspected. The operation had recovered not just scrap, but sensitive equipment, weapons, and evidence that pointed to something far more serious. Among the files were photographs, technician notes, and a full breakdown of the recovered torpedo's design. The documents also revealed that one of the goals of the mission was to study Soviet missile command systems and test for evidence of unauthorized launch attempts. The files proved that the CIA had downplayed the success of the operation for a reason. Admitting what they had pulled from the ocean could have risked nuclear escalation. The United States had not only stolen part of a Soviet submarine, but also uncovered material that hinted at internal conflict on board. The fact that they had found bodies made it even more sensitive. The burial at sea, done quietly and without Soviet knowledge, was not just about respect, it was about keeping the truth hidden. Even now, many details about what was inside the K-129 remain classified. But the part that has come out shows that this wasn't just about salvage. It was a race for secrets, and the United States won that race. What the CIA found at the bottom of the Pacific was more than wreckage. It was a window into a dangerous moment the world never knew had happened. But just when we thought we'd seen the last of the K-129 story, another shocking discovery was just made, and it will change everything we thought we knew about the Soviet K-129 story. Stay glued as we break it down. The shocking discovery about K-129.
Military war materiel. You're talking about a situation that could very likely start a nuclear war. So even if you can figure out how to do it, you have to do it in secret.
In early 2025, something unexpected hit the public. A declassified memo from the NSA quietly made its way online. At first, it seemed like just another old Cold War document, but once analysts and researchers started listening, the weight of it became clear. It was a complete audio log, pulled from the depths of the Pacific and cleaned up using modern sound technology. The recording captured the final minutes aboard K-129, and it didn't match any of the official stories told for over 50 years. It didn't sound like a mechanical failure. It didn't sound like a quiet end. It sounded like panic, shouting, weapons fire, and then a violent blast. The sounds were raw, chaotic, and human. What they revealed changed everything people thought they knew about what happened that day. As the recording was studied, experts confirmed that the disaster wasn't caused by an accident. There was no sudden system fault or hull breach from pressure. The voices captured told a different story. A rogue officer had taken control of part of the sub, locking himself inside a missile control area. Based on the audio and matching logs from the recovered wreck, he had initiated a launch sequence for one of the nuclear missiles. The target was never confirmed, but the coordinates he entered pointed in the general direction of Hawaii. If he had succeeded, it would have sparked a war that would have changed the entire world. But he didn't get that far. Another crew member, possibly the executive officer, tried to stop him. The confrontation turned into a struggle. Multiple voices were yelling, followed by gunshots. A few seconds later, the sound of a small explosion was captured. That blast likely came from a scuffle in the weapons bay, triggering a larger detonation that tore through the forward section of the submarine. In those final moments, The audio recorded fading alarms, cries for help, and then silence. Nothing about it suggested an ordinary accident. It was sabotage from inside. Long before the public ever heard this, the United States had already known. That is not all. Intercepted signals had reached American listening posts in 1968, just minutes after the first alarm was triggered, aboard K-129. The U.S. picked up on emergency codes that didn't match regular Soviet communication patterns. Something about the way those messages were sent made analysts take them seriously. They moved fast. Submarines were rerouted, and spy satellites were realigned. They needed to find the wreck before the Soviets did, and they did just that. But they also needed to make sure no one knew why they were searching. The more profound truth didn't come out until a whistleblower, someone with long ties to Project Azorian, released the full internal report in 2025. The report had stayed locked inside CIA vaults for decades. It was more than just a technical review. It included handwritten notes, private interviews with recovered crew data analysts, and pages describing what the United States had found in that sunken sub. The CIA hadn't just pulled up metal and weapons, they had recovered experimental warheads, ones that didn't match any standard Soviet design. Alongside them were sealed cases of encoded communication logs. Some of those logs suggested the sub had gone off script. Its course had changed during its last hours. It wasn't heading where it was supposed to go. Analysts at the time began to suspect that K-129 was involved in something darker. The idea forming inside intelligence circles was that this might have been a rogue Soviet mission, possibly a black operation that spiraled out of control. The records included mentions of strange activity by the submarine days before it went silent. Messages had been sent on an unusual channel. Course changes were logged without command approval. And then, silence. Confirmation didn't come from the US side alone. Around the same time the NSA audio was declassified and the whistleblower's report hit the surface, a Russian dissident released old Soviet documents that matched what the CIA had suspected. These papers had been copied secretly decades ago by someone inside the Soviet military archive system. They showed that the Soviet command had also feared the sub had gone rogue. One internal memo discussed the possibility of mutiny, but the matter was buried after the wreck was lost. Admitting that a Soviet officer had tried to launch a nuclear weapon would have damaged the image of total control. So they denied it ever happened. The United States knew the truth. They had the audio, the wreck, and the logs, but they didn't say anything. They had proof of a near-nuclear disaster, and they chose to keep it quiet. The reasoning was simple. If the Soviets found out what the US knew, they might have seen it as a threat. They might have believed the Americans were preparing to use the information against them. Or worse, they might have thought the Americans had caused it. Either way, the risk of open conflict was too high. So the truth was buried with the wreck, the bodies, and the records. Now that the audio is public and the documents are out, what once seemed like a tragic accident is being seen for what it was, a close call with nuclear war. And for over 50 years, no one knew how close it came. But what made this situation even more disturbing was what those experimental warheads and odd logs hinted at. There was more to this mission than a rogue officer. Something else was at play. Something still wrapped in layers of codes and questions. By 2025, a fuller picture of the K-129 disaster had finally come into focus. The submarine wasn't just lost with its crew, it was carrying 3 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, and one had been fully armed at the time of the sabotage. The rogue officer who triggered the crisis had reportedly planned to launch that missile toward Hawaii, using forged radio signatures to make it appear as though China had fired the shot. The goal was a false flag strike, meant to spark war between the United States and China, dragging the Soviet Union in afterward. If he had succeeded, World War III would have begun in 1968. The CIA kept the secret buried. To prevent panic and Soviet backlash, American divers quietly tampered with the wreck during recovery, removing components and clearing evidence of the operation. Meanwhile, Several top Soviet naval officers vanished during internal purges. In 2025, families of the K-129 crew finally learned the truth after decades of lies. Even Howard Hughes, whose name fronted the ship, had been unaware of its real purpose. Declassified memos revealed that President Nixon personally approved a misinformation campaign, and now, modern sonar scans show the wreck was moved in 1975, relocated to erase all traces of what nearly started a nuclear war. Thank you for staying with us. What do you think actually sank the Soviet K-129 submarine? Share your opinions with us in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Also, click the following video on your screen and you will enjoy it.